The heavy toxicology manual slammed into the intruder's face with a sickening crunch of bone. But the blood spraying across the study floor wasn't what made Karen's heart stop. It was the stack of offshore bank statements scattered beneath his boots. Documents that proved her father, the city's most trusted hero, had a price for every poisoned child in Flint. Outside, the headlights of a black SUV cut through the rain, prowling the driveway like a predator that already knew its prey was trapped. Karen pressed her back against the locked door, the cold metal of a stolen USB drive biting into her palm. Downstairs, the heavy thud of a second set of boots echoed through the hollow house, methodical and unafraid. She looked at the framed photo of her father on the desk. His smile now felt like a mask for a monster. As the doorknob began to turn with a slow, agonizing creak, Karen realized the man she had spent her life mourning wasn't the victim of a tragedy. He was the architect of a massacre, and someone was willing to kill to keep his legacy buried. The air inside the Flint emergency room functioned as a thick, recirculated soup of bleach and stale sweat. Karen Whitmore pressed her palms against the convulsing body of a small boy, the child's skin having turned a sickly, translucent gray. His teeth ground together, clicking out a frantic staccato rhythm that echoed against the tiled walls, while white foam bubbled at the corners of his mouth with every ragged, hitching exhale. Karen shouted for a nurse, her voice demanding diazepam. But the order drowned in the relentless roar of the overcrowded corridor. Dozens of people groaned on tattered gurneys, a sea of human misery that the hospital could no longer contain. Karen's fingers fumbled against the boy's thin neck, seeking a pulse that skipped like a dying engine. His pupils rolled back, leaving only the dull, milky whites exposed to the flickering fluorescent lights. She jammed her knee into the edge of the cot, bracing herself to hold the thrashing frame steady, desperate to keep the child's head from shattering against the cold steel guardrail. Karen pointed a trembling finger at the dark, leaden line tracing the patient's gums, then at the fine tremor vibrating through his small fingers. She fought to keep her own voice from splintering into shards of panic. Behind the admissions desk, Miller flipped through a stack of forms with an indifference that felt like a physical blow. He never once looked up. Karen's restraint snapped. She began shouting, a rapid-fire recitation of the symptoms of acute lead encephalopathy. She demanded the immediate release of chelating agents, her words sharp as scalpels. Miller merely tapped his pen against the desk, a rhythmic, hollow sound, and pointed to a glaringly empty column in the supply ledger. Karen clenched her fists until her nails bit deep into the meat of her palms, staring at the locked medication cabinet that stood like a taunting monolith. The roar in her ears grew deafening, swallowing Miller's pathetic excuses about budget limits and supply chain failures. Behind her, in the hallway, another resident of Flint began to gasp for air that felt like water. The floorboards in the foyer of the old Whitmore house groaned under Karen's weight, a sharp protest against the stagnant silence of the place. She ran her fingertips over a thick blanket of dust covering the oak sideboard where her father's keys still lay exactly where he had left them. The air tasted of old paper and the faint, ghostly scent of pipe tobacco, a smell that had always served as her anchor of safety. Karen lowered herself into the cracked leather chair in the study, inhaling the chill of the empty rooms. Long shadows from the bare oak branches outside crawled across the wallpaper like skeletal fingers, dragging her back to childhood evenings spent reading by the fire. She pulled her father's old wool blazer from the back of the chair and pressed her face into the fabric, desperately searching the weave for a lingering trace of warmth or comfort. Anything to counter the desolation of the city outside. Karen took a single step toward the towering bookshelf, and a sharp, metallic click rang out from beneath the sole of her boot. She froze. Under her weight, the edge of a wide oak floorboard dipped unnaturally. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she dropped to her knees, fumbling in her pocket for the kitchen knife she'd brought from the sink. She wedged the blade into the seam, prying with a grunt of exertion. The board gave way with a dry, splintering crack, revealing the cold, polished gleam of industrial steel. Tucked between the floor joists sat a rectangular metal box, its surface unmarred by the dust of the room, fitted with a heavy-duty combination lock. The chill of the metal burned her fingertips as she felt along the edge, searching for the hidden latch that guarded her father's final secret. The lid of the cache swung open with a heavy, echoing clang, revealing neat stacks of documents bound in expensive leather folders. Karen pulled the top sheet free, her eyes narrowing as she scanned columns of figures stamped with the insignias of offshore banks in the Cayman Islands. Tucked between the ledgers, she found a small, black USB drive wrapped in a scrap of yellowed newspaper. Her hands shook, the paper rattling, as she cross-referenced the dates of the massive wire transfers with the timeline of her father's appointment as the head of water quality control. Sums with 6 zeros sat mockingly beside the very months the city's pipes had begun to rot. She squeezed the flash drive in her palm, its sharp plastic edges digging into her skin. The silence of the house suddenly felt predatory, and the hidden wealth of the celebrated engineer Whitmore felt like a physical weight, a filthy secret that scorched her touch. Karen spread the bank statements across the desk, her movements frantic as she aligned the dates of the bribes with the internal schedules for filter replacements. Every digit on those pages seemed to morph into the faces of the lead-poisoned children she had treated that afternoon. She found her father's elegant, precise signature at the bottom of inspection reports for rusted, corroded mains, pipes he had officially certified as structurally sound. A spasm of pure, unadulterated rage constricted her throat. She calculated the cost of every new car, every tailored suit her father had worn, and realized they were paid for in the neurological health of Flint's youth. She looked at the framed family photo on the corner of the desk. The man smiling back at her now looked like a stranger wearing a dead man's skin. Her father's betrayal possessed a tangible form now. The toxic water flowing through every tap in the city. She slid the flash drive into her laptop, waiting with bated breath as the screen flickered to life, revealing folders packed with technical data. Karen's eyes widened as she scrolled through files dated 6 months before the official catastrophe was ever acknowledged. The lead levels recorded in these internal memos were catastrophic, far beyond the legal limits. She read through the inter-office correspondence where her father had coolly argued for the suppression of the data, citing a need to maintain a stable investment climate for the upcoming fiscal year. The mouse in her hand became slick with sweat. She clicked through high-resolution photos of corroded water mains, images her father had meticulously archived, even as he lied to the public. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had systematically built the foundation for a mass poisoning while she had worshipped his professional integrity. A sudden, violent crash of breaking glass from the floor below made Karen bolt upright, the leather folder slipping from her lap to the floor. She sat motionless, straining to hear over the thundering of her own blood. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed from the foyer, moving directly toward the stairs. Karen lunged for the lamp switch, plunging the study into a thick, suffocating darkness broken only by the pale, ghostly glow of the laptop screen. Her breathing became shallow and jagged as she slid off the chair, huddling against the floor. Downstairs, she heard the heavy thud of overturned furniture and the muffled, guttural curse of a man she didn't recognize. She pressed her back against the cold wood of the desk, feeling a wave of icy terror wash over her as the footsteps began to creak up the stairs, moving closer to the study door with every passing second. The door to the study flew open under the force of a powerful kick, and a massive silhouette filled the frame, a man in a dark tactical mask. He lunged toward the desk, sweeping the lamp aside in a spray of glass, and Karen caught the wicked glint of a blade in his hand. The intruder grabbed her shoulder, his fingers like iron talons, and tried to pry the flash drive from her white-knuckled grip. Karen fought back with a primal desperation, the air around her thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and damp wool. A jagged fingernail tore across her wrist, drawing a hot sting of blood and forcing a cry of pain from her throat. She twisted her body, trying to slide out of his grasp, but he slammed her against the edge of the desk, his weight pinning her down as he demanded the drive in a hoarse, fractured whisper. Her hand swept across the desk, searching for anything to use as a weapon, until her fingers brushed the heavy, buckram-bound spine of a medical toxicology manual. Karen lunged forward, putting every ounce of her weight and her mounting fury into a swing, slamming the massive tome directly into the intruder's masked face. A sickening, wet crunch of bone followed, and the man shrieked, his grip on her shoulder failing instantly. She watched him stagger back, clutching a shattered nose, blood beginning to blossom through the fabric of his mask. Karen didn't give him a chance to recover. She drove her shoulder into his chest, sent him stumbling over the loose floorboard she had pried up earlier. He went down hard, his head hitting the floor with a dull thud, dazed and blinded by the sudden agony. Karen scrambled to her feet, bracing her legs against the carpet as she shoved the reeling man toward the hallway. He tried to catch the doorframe, but she slammed the heavy manual down onto his fingers, forcing him to let go. As he tumbled out onto the landing, she heaved the heavy oak doors shut with a finality that shook the walls. Her hands shook so violently she could barely find the steel bolt, but she forced it into the socket with a desperate shove. On the other side of the wood, the man began to rain blows against the paneling, his screams of rage vibrating through the heavy timber. Karen threw her entire weight against the door, her feet skidding on the rug, feeling the cold sweat pour down her spine as the intruder tried to batter his way back inside. She slid down the length of the locked door until she hit the floor, clutching the black flash drive to her chest so hard the plastic bit into her skin. Her breath came in ragged, sobbing gasps that filled the dark room. Karen swung her legs over the windowsill, the rough brick of the exterior wall scraping the skin from her palms. The biting night air felt like a slap to her lungs as she dropped into the waist-high, brittle grass of the backyard and sprinted for her car. The engine turned over with a frantic, metallic roar, and she slammed the vehicle into gear, tires spitting gravel as she tore onto the empty road. In the rearview mirror, two piercing needles of halogen light cut through the dark. A black SUV glided from the shadow of a side street, pacing her with the terrifying precision of an apex predator. The glare of the high beams flooded her cabin, turning the windshield into a milky, opaque sheet, and her hands on the wheel into trembling, pale bone. She yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, the tires screaming in protest as she swerved into a labyrinth of rusted industrial hangars and hollowed-out warehouses. Gravel drummed a frantic rhythm against the undercarriage, while she sped past the skeletal remains of old factory cranes. Ahead, the low brick profile of the Whitmore Press Building appeared, its neon sign flickering with a dying hum. Karen slammed on the brakes, leaving twin streaks of scorched rubber on the asphalt, and bolted from the car before the engine had even died. Her fingers hammered against the heavy steel door, the echoes of her desperation bouncing off the silent, windowless walls of the industrial block. She glanced over her shoulder. The predatory glow of the SUV's headlights was already licking the corners of the nearby buildings, closing the distance. The heavy interior bolts hissed back, and Marcus Whitmore yanked his sister into a dim foyer that smelled of ozone and stale paper dust. The harsh light of a single overhead bulb exposed his haggard face and eyes that darted with a frantic, red-rimmed energy. Instead of an embrace, Marcus stepped into her path, blocking her way into the main shop, his dry fingers digging into her shoulders. He was breathing in short, shallow bursts, and Karen could feel the tremors vibrating through his arms. He didn't ask if she was hurt. His voice was a jagged, desperate whisper as he demanded to see exactly what she had scavenged from their father's hidden cache. Karen watched a bead of greasy sweat roll down his forehead, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. Karen shoved a thick stack of bank statements onto a table piled with blueprints, the pages fluttering and sliding to reveal the stamps of offshore tax havens. Marcus didn't even glance at the figures. He simply squeezed his eyes shut as if the sight of the paper caused him physical pain. In a low, cracking voice, he confessed that every cent funneled into those accounts had been used to keep the press running, to pay off the suffocating debts that had threatened to swallow the family name. Karen stood frozen as he justified their father's lies as a necessary evil to save the business and the local jobs it provided. His voice dropped to a hollow, gutless tone when he admitted he had seen the toxicity reports a year ago, but chose silence over the bankruptcy of the Whitmore legacy. She took a sharp step back, her spine hitting the cold, oily edge of a massive printing press. Her gaze searched Marcus's face, hunting for any trace of the brother she had grown up with in this very shop. The realization that he had knowingly paid his utility bills with the neurological health of thousands of children hit her like a physical blow, bringing a surge of bile to the back of her throat. She saw now that Marcus didn't want to save her. He wanted to save the evidence that tied him to a slow-motion massacre. The space between them filled with a thick, suffocating silence of a betrayal too deep for words. Karen clutched her bag to her chest. The walls of the family business, once a sanctuary, now feeling like the interior of a tomb. The front door buckled under a strike so violent that flakes of plaster snowed down from the ceiling into Karen's hair. The heavy hinges shrieked, and two men in tactical vests and unmarked dark jackets burst into the foyer. Marcus froze, his face draining of color, until he was the same sickly white as the paper rolls behind him. He breathed the word corporate under his breath. The mercenaries didn't offer a word of greeting. One snapped a telescoping baton into place, while the other moved with practiced ease to block the only exit. Karen saw a chilling, mechanical void in their eyes, a total absence of human empathy. Marcus took a faltering step toward them, his voice a pathetic whine as he tried to mention some prearranged agreement. But one of the men simply backhanded him into a stack of crates without looking. Marcus suddenly lunged for Karen, his fingers clawing at the leather strap of her bag. She felt his nails rake across her forearm and saw the raw, animal terror in his eyes. Not for her, but for himself. She jerked her shoulder back and delivered a short, sharp elbow to his sternum. He crumpled, gasping for air, and Karen didn't wait to see him recover. She bolted into the dark labyrinth of the massive printing machines. Her soles skidded on the oil-slicked concrete, while the heavy, rhythmic thud of the mercenaries' boots echoed behind her, punctuated by Marcus's frantic shouts. She dove under a series of low-hanging steel girders, her heart hammering against her ribs as she sought the deepest shadows at the far end of the warehouse. She sprinted through the thundering heart of the press room, where the automated machines continued their mindless, clattering cycles. Enormous steel rollers spun with a lethal velocity, spraying droplets of black ink that stung her face and mingled with her sweat. The rhythmic, bone-shaking scream of metal on metal was deafening, turning every step into a battle against the vibration of the floor. Karen squeezed through the narrow gaps between vibrating housings, the air thick with the smell of scorched iron and caustic solvents. Shadows cast by the moving mechanical arms danced across the brick walls, disorienting her as the mercenaries began a methodical sweep of the equipment rows. The air grew hot and stagnant, making every lungful of oxygen a struggle as she neared the emergency exit. A shadow cut across her path near the high loading platform where massive paper rolls, weighing hundreds of pounds, were stacked to the ceiling. One of the men lunged, his fingers grazing the collar of her coat. Karen planted her feet against a concrete ledge and shoved a heavy metal trolley with everything she had. The massive cylinders of paper groaned and then cascaded downward in a thundering landslide, burying the mercenary beneath a mountain of pulp. She heard a sharp, sickening snap and a muffled cry as the trolley overturned directly onto the man's legs. Without pausing to see if the second man was closing in, Karen scrambled over the fallen rolls and bolted for the narrow iron stairs leading to the administrative offices above. Karen pressed her forehead against the cold, vibrating glass of a window on the staircase landing, her breath fogging the pain. Below, on the street illuminated by the harsh orange glow of the city lamps, a patrol car cruised by with its lights silently revolving. Hope flared in her chest for a fleeting second before it was extinguished by a cold, numbing horror. She watched as the officer slowed down next to the black SUV, exchanging a brief, familiar nod with the driver. The police car didn't stop. It simply rolled on, disappearing into the dark and leaving Karen alone with the men hired to erase her. She realized then that the city's justice system was just another line item in the ledger her father had so carefully managed. She burst into the cramped staff locker room and slammed the door, clicking the flimsy lock into place with a trembling hand. In the sudden silence of the small room, Marcus's voice echoed from the hallway, sounding shrill and broken. He was pleading with the men not to hurt her, promising them that Karen would hand over the drive if they just scared her enough. She listened to her own brother bargain for his safety with her life, his voice cracking as he offered to help them corner her. Karen pressed her palm over her mouth to stifle a scream of pure, incandescent rage. A heavy blow struck the door, making the thin wood paneling shudder, and she looked around the room with wide, panicked eyes, searching for anything she could use to survive the next minute. Karen backed into the furthest corner of the room, wedging herself between a row of dented lockers and a pile of oily rags. Her fingers swept across a low shelf and closed around a pair of long, heavy-duty industrial shears used for cutting thick cardstock. She gripped the cold metal rings, feeling the weight of the steel in her hand. The locker room door groaned as a mercenary threw his weight against it, the frame splintering and sending shards of wood skittering across the floor. She watched a hand in a black leather glove reach through the new gap, fumbling for the lock. Karen pulled herself up by her elbows, her shoulders scraping against the jagged edges of the narrow ventilation duct. The thin sheet metal groaned under her weight, and century-old dust flooded her nose, forcing a muffled, racking cough. She slid out the other end, falling onto the cracked asphalt of the hospital's rear loading dock, the impact stinging her palms and knees. Limping, she ducked through the heavy, swinging doors of the service entrance, where the low hum of the morgue's refrigeration units mingled with the sharp, chemical bite of formalin. She snatched a discarded white lab coat from a hook in the hallway, throwing it over her shoulders and ducking her head to hide her face. Among the frantic staff and the patients moaning in the overcrowded corridors, Karen's silhouette blurred, becoming just one more harried ghost in the sterile labyrinth. She pressed her back against the wall as a gurney thundered past, its metal side rails rattling like gunfire. On the stained sheets lay Mr. Henderson, his face now a hollowed-out skull draped in jaundiced, parchment-thin skin. Karen saw his chest barely moving, his lungs struggling for shallow, hitching gasps of air. His thin wrists were tethered to the rails with soft cloth restraints, and a catheter bag hung from the side of the bed, filled with a dark, cloudy fluid. She only recognized her old mentor by the jagged, faded scar on his chin. Mr. Henderson's eyes, clouded over with thick white cataracts, wandered aimlessly across the ceiling lights, never once settling on Karen's horrified face as he rolled toward the intensive care unit. Karen pressed a cold stethoscope to Mr. Henderson's chest, catching the erratic, fading thrum of a heart that was losing its fight. She pressed her fingers into his ankles. The skin didn't bounce back, leaving deep pits in the fluid-logged tissue. His kidneys had finally surrendered. She leaned in close, noting the fine tremor in his eyelids and the earthy, grayish tint of his sclera. The lead that had spent years leaching into his bones was now flooding his bloodstream, systematically shutting down his organs. The air around him was heavy with the sharp, metallic tang of ammonia, the smell of a body poisoning itself from the inside out. Karen realized she was looking at the living evidence of her father's technical negligence. A man she had loved now reduced to an agonizing ruin. Mr. Henderson's hand suddenly shot out, his dry fingers locking onto the sleeve of Karen's coat with surprising strength. His lips, cracked and bleeding, moved in a frantic, silent rhythm, before a whistling wheeze finally broke through. Karen leaned down until her ear was inches from his mouth, feeling the heat of his labored breath. He rasped her father's name, his voice breaking into a wet, productive cough. She caught fragments of sentences, nighttime phone calls, folders marked with blue corporate seals, the weight of a secret too heavy to carry. He swallowed hard, his eyes briefly clearing with a flash of pure terror. He whispered that her father had tried to stop the pumps when the first tests came back black. But a shadow had already been standing in his office, holding the keys to his offshore accounts. Karen bolted from the bedside, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum as she sprinted toward the basement wing where the hospital archives were buried. She tore through the aisles, her fingers flying over the spines of folders and sending clouds of gray dust into the air. She pulled the medical records for the East Side District, and the pages were a litany of nephropathy and unexplained cognitive decline. The dates on the charts aligned perfectly with the timelines she'd found on her father's drive. She clutched the bundle of papers to her chest, the physical weight of the evidence feeling like an impossible burden. Every sheet of paper was a death warrant her father had co-signed, a systematic destruction of a neighborhood he had been paid to protect. A sharp, metallic scrape echoed through the archive, the sound of a key turning in the heavy lock. Karen lunged for the exit, but the door was already dead. Through the small, wire-reinforced window, Marcus's face appeared, distorted by a mask of desperate rage. He pressed his palm against the glass, leaving a smear of sweat on the pane. He was breathing hard, his breath fogging the window and obscuring her view of his eyes. Karen yanked the handle, but it remained a cold, unyielding lump of steel. Marcus stared at his sister through the glass, with the hollowed-out look of a man who had traded his soul for a printing press and was now realizing the deal was coming due. Marcus found the master key and burst into the aisle, his shoulder catching a stack of boxes and sending them tumbling. His tie was yanked loose, and a fresh, angry scratch ran down his cheek. He grabbed Karen by the upper arms, shaking her until her teeth rattled. He screamed that the creditors were at his front door, that if she didn't hand over the drive, he'd be floating in the Flint River by dawn. Karen felt his thumbs dig into her windpipe, cutting off her air until black spots began to dance in her vision. Marcus's eyes were bloodshot, fixed in a stare of pure, unthinking panic. He demanded the drive again, his spit hitting her face as he shoved her back against the jagged metal edge of a storage shelf. Karen gasped for air, her hands clawing at Marcus's wrists, and pointed a trembling finger toward the hall where Mr. Henderson was dying. She tried to force out words about conscience, about how their father had murdered his own best friend for a stack of Cayman Island bank statements. Marcus didn't flinch. To him, Henderson was just a regrettable statistic, a ghost that was getting in the way of a business transaction. Karen saw the same ruthless, bottom-line greed in Marcus's eyes that must have lived in their father's heart. He growled at her to shut up and threw his weight forward, slamming her back into the shelving unit with a force that knocked the wind from her lungs. Marcus yanked the bag from her limp fingers and shoved her into the small janitor's closet at the end of the aisle. Karen hit the tile floor hard, inhaling the sharp, suffocating scent of bleach and wet mops. Before she could scramble up, the door slammed shut. She heard the heavy thud of a filing cabinet being dragged across the concrete, the metal shrieking until it wedged firmly against the doorframe. Karen hammered her fists against the wood, but it didn't even budge under the weight of the massive steel obstacle. Marcus shouted something unintelligible on the other side, his voice fading as it was replaced by the frantic rustle of paper and the heavy stomp of his boots moving away. She pressed her ear to the door, catching the muffled sounds of the archive. A rhythmic metallic thud followed, the sound of a hammer striking plastic. Marcus was trying to smash the flash drive on the concrete floor. Karen held her breath, but the hammering stopped abruptly. From the stairwell, a heavy, synchronized stomping of boots echoed through the basement, followed by a sharp, barked command. She heard Marcus let out a short, terrified yelp, and the sound of the hammer hitting the floor rang out like a bell. The footsteps of the mercenaries grew louder, drowning out Marcus's whimpering as he scrambled to hide among the shelves. The corporate cleaners had finally arrived to finish the job. Karen fumbled in the dark of the closet, her hands knocking over a gallon jug of isopropyl alcohol. She ripped the cap off, the sharp, medicinal fumes stinging her eyes. She began pouring the liquid through the gap at the bottom of the door, watching the clear pool spread out into the archive where Marcus was hiding. She reached into the pocket of the stolen lab coat and found a disposable lighter. She flicked the wheel, a spark jumping in the dark. Karen screamed through the door that if Marcus didn't move the cabinet right now, she'd turn the entire archive into a funeral pyre for the both of them. The orange flame of the lighter danced in her hand, illuminating her face, streaked with soot, dust, and a cold, final resolve. Karen lowered the trembling flame to the clear pool of alcohol at the base of the door. The blue fire blossomed with a soft, hungry whoomph, instantly racing across the floor and catching the alcohol-soaked rags she had shoved through the gap. The end. Do not proceed past this point.